You can feel the tremor of change long before the ground actually moves. A decade is rarely enough time for history to fully pivot, but sometimes it's enough for the world to admit that the old rules no longer work. And in the years between 2025 and 2035, you can sense something subtle yet undeniable happening. A shift in how humans think, organize, argue, build, and dream. This decade is not defined by a single monumental invention or a sudden collapse. Instead, it unfolds like the slow cracking of ice, fracture lines appearing everywhere at once, some barely noticeable, others enormous enough to redraw the landscape beneath our feet. It is the decade when the momentum of the 20th century finally runs out, and something wholly new, unpredictable, algorithmic, deeply interconnected, begins to rise in its place. The soft arrival of everyday AI. By the early 2030s, AI is no longer seen as a thing you use. You simply live with it. It floats beneath the surface of ordinary life, predicting traffic patterns before the first car leaves the driveway, adjusting global shipping routes in real time, or forecasting mental health crises days before they manifest. The world will still argue endlessly about intelligence, sentience, and rights, but the practical truth is that AI becomes something else entirely. A global cognitive substrate. Not a brain, not a tool, but a layer, woven through every institution and every decision. In these early years, millions quietly shift into roles that didn't exist before. AI auditors, model ethicists, synthetic creativity supervisors, trust engineers, algorithmic diplomats, and simultaneously, millions of older roles begin to blur into irrelevance. Not all at once, not dramatically, but like wallpaper fading in the sun. Energy transitions and the uneven map. The energy transition doesn't happen cleanly. It happens the way ice breaks in a thaw, with cracks, with stubbornly cold pockets, with sudden collapses and unexpected breakthroughs. Cheap solar reaches, places still struggling with basic infrastructure, creating islands of technological acceleration across Africa, Southeast Asia, Latin America. Unexpected hubs of innovation forming in regions long neglected. Meanwhile, countries reliant on fossil fuel exports stagger under the weight of an increasingly obsolete business model. Their influence wanes. New alliances form where the flow of energy is clean, abundant, and decentralized. For the first time, energy stops being a lever of global dominance. Instead, it becomes something closer to a public good, distributed, resilient, and algorithmically optimized. The demographic slide. In the 2025 to 2035 decade, populations don't just age, they rearrange themselves. Shrinking workforces push governments to adopt automation faster than originally planned. Cities experiment with 4-day work weeks. Entire industries restructure around the fact that there simply aren't enough young people to fill the jobs that once powered national economies. Meanwhile, migration patterns change not out of preference but necessity. Some regions grow hotter, drier, more volatile. Others become sanctuaries of stability. The world quietly rearranges itself, one moving family at a time, until the demographic map looks nothing like it did at the start of the century. The politics of the fractured middle. Politics in this decade becomes something like a high-tension cable pulled tight between competing visions of the future. Traditional political parties struggle to remain relevant. Their rhetoric feels increasingly disconnected from the world people inhabit, where algorithms shape daily life and long-term problems can no longer be kicked down the road. New coalitions form, technocratic councils, climate stabilization blocs, youth-led governance groups, hybrid democracy platforms mixing human deliberation with algorithmic planning. Some regions embrace these experiments. Others reject them as threats to national sovereignty. A quiet truth begins to emerge. Political systems built for the 19th and 20th centuries cannot survive the pressures of the 21st. People feel it in their bones, even if they cannot articulate it. The slow redefinition of normal. By 2035, everyday norms feel subtly rearranged. People outsource parts of their memory to AI companions. Neighborhoods adopt shared autonomous vehicles instead of personal cars. Supply chains become so predictive that shortages start to feel like artifacts from a forgotten age. Climate adaptation becomes part of architecture, city design, and household planning. Privacy, once seen as a right, reshapes itself into a negotiated relationship between individuals and the algorithms that help them navigate their world. Nothing collapses. Nothing ends dramatically. Instead, the old world simply stops being recognizable, replaced by a new one forming quietly beneath it. This is the decade when humanity begins its slow migration away from industrial-age thinking and into something more fluid, more uncertain, more algorithmically shaped. The first fractures appear, the foundation shifts, and the future, vast, uneasy, full of possibility, begins to show itself in the cracks. There are decades where everything accelerates at once. Moments in history when society seems to rearrange itself like metal filings pulled by a magnet, quietly, inevitably, toward a new center of gravity. Between 2035 and 2045, the world transitions from dabbling in automation to depending on it. And in that shift, the very definition of what it means to work, govern, and belong begins to dissolve. This is the decade when automation is no longer coming soon. It is here, woven into the infrastructure, the economy, and the rhythm of daily life. And as human labor unspools from its centuries-long role as the engine of civilization, society begins rewriting itself in real time. The automation tipping point. At first, the changes feel incremental. Warehouses switching to robotic fleets, highways dominated by autonomous freight convoys, hospitals running predictive triage systems that can spot patterns doctors miss, agriculture quietly transformed by machine-run soil monitors, self-repairing irrigation webs, and seed variants optimized by simulation. But gradual shifts accumulate, and suddenly the world reaches a threshold it had only theorized. Automation now performs more global labor hours than humans. This milestone isn't announced. It's inferred, noticed by economists, whispered in political circles, later confirmed in corporate transparency reports. Humanity steps into a new landscape without a map. The rise of synthetic intelligence labor. AI assistants mature into something closer to organizational partners, managing supply chains, negotiating trade agreements, writing legal frameworks, and forecasting political instability long before it becomes visible. In many sectors, synthetic intelligence becomes the default worker, infinitely scalable, tireless, immune to burnout, able to run millions of concurrent processes. The human role shifts upward, becoming supervisory, strategic, or deeply creative, depending on the industry. But the truth grows unmistakable. The world needs fewer workers, yet it needs more meaning. This gap becomes the defining tension of the decade. Economics without work. Governments scramble to understand the implications. Productivity skyrockets, yet traditional economic models, built on consumption, taxation, and employment, strain under the new reality. Different regions experiment with new approaches, automation dividends, paid out as public revenue, AI-stabilized currencies designed to prevent runaway inequality, talent-based citizenship tracks that reward problem-solving rather than birthplace, community contribution requirements replacing wage-based taxation. Some nations adapt and flourish. Others cling to outdated models and fracture under the pressure, watching their institutions calcify as the world moves on without them. The rewriting of social norms. As work shifts from necessity to optionality, society undergoes a deep philosophical reset. People begin defining themselves less by what they do and more by what they build, learn, and care for. Education morphs from a rigid system into a lifelong, fluid experience. Micro-academies spread across cities. Virtual knowledge communities form in seconds, dissolve just as quickly, and reform elsewhere around new ideas. The nuclear family model loosens. People cluster into chosen communities, co-living networks, ideological micro-societies, lifestyle collectives built around creativity, sustainability, or shared values. Millions relocate not for jobs, but for identity. Entire regions reinvent themselves as hubs of culture, innovation, or ecological restoration, drawing populations that resonate with their mission. The psychology of the new world. In the midst of these changes, an uneasy truth surfaces. Human identity had been tethered to labor for so long that freedom feels disorienting. Some embrace the new landscape with open arms, diving into personal projects, artistic endeavors, and intellectual pursuits. Others experience a drifting sensation, a quiet struggle to locate purpose in a world that no longer demands their labor. This becomes one of the great challenges of the era, not technological, but emotional, not political, but existential. How does a species redefine its purpose when survival no longer requires toil? Political structures begin to deform. Politics strains under the weight of rapid change. Traditional parties splinter. New governance movements emerge as algorithmic councils, cooperative democracies, continuous voting systems, hybrid parliaments where AI models and human representatives share deliberation. Some nations adopt predictive governance frameworks, policies dynamically adjusted in real time by models trained on environmental, economic, and demographic feedback loops. Other regions resist fiercely, seeing these systems as threats to autonomy or cultural tradition. Global politics becomes a tapestry of experimentation, fragmentation, and unexpected innovation. This is the decade when the world as we once knew it, built on labor, scarcity, and political rigidity, begins to shed its old skin. Humanity stands at the threshold of a new reality, not fully prepared, but propelled forward by forces too large to resist. The age of automation arrives, and society, facing its own reflection, begins the long and uncertain task of rewriting itself. There comes a moment in every civilization when the cities that once defined it no longer match its needs. Between 2045 and 2055, humanity faces that realization with striking clarity. The urban world, built in the 20th century's image of cars, concrete, and limitless sprawl, reaches a turning point, and rather than collapse outright, it begins to metamorphose. This decade becomes known as the Great Urban Rebuild, not because cities crumble suddenly, but because they finally begin the long overdue process of becoming something new. Lighter, smarter, weather-adapted, AI-integrated, pedestrian-centered, and tuned for a world that no longer revolves around congestion, fossil fuels, or frantic commutes. The climate migration wave. It begins subtly. Neighborhoods in vulnerable coastal regions witness rising insurance rates, then rising tides, then the slow march of retreat. Desert cities confront record heat seasons, lasting more than half the year. Agricultural zones shift latitudinally, leaving old farmlands barren and new farmlands buzzing with activity. By the early 2050s, tens of millions of people relocate, not in panic, not as refugees, but as part of a steady, coordinated migration. Governments, having learned from earlier crises, now plan for this movement with unprecedented foresight. New inland cities emerge. Others expand vertically rather than outward, absorbing waves of climate migrants into sustainable urban ecosystems designed from scratch. The fall of car-centric infrastructure. The personal automobile, once the centerpiece of economic and cultural life, begins its rapid decline. Most cities restrict private car ownership to historical districts or specialized needs. Highways transform into green corridors, freight channels, and elevated mobility platforms for autonomous fleets. Parking lots dissolve into community gardens, micro-housing, and solar fields. Mobility becomes a service, not a possession. AI-managed transit webs respond dynamically to population flows, weather, demand, and events. The world's cities grow quieter, cleaner, more walkable. People discover, with a kind of collective nostalgia, what it feels like to reclaim the streets as shared spaces rather than asphalt rivers. The rise of AI-designed architecture. Buildings begin to look different, not simply futuristic, but adaptive, shifting facades and interior layouts based on climate, occupancy, and use. Walls embedded with living materials modulate temperature passively. Towers grow like vertical forests, absorbing carbon, recycling water, and providing wildlife corridors high above the ground. New districts appear almost organic, shaped by millions of simulations run by architectural AIs, trained not only on efficiency and safety, but on beauty, comfort, cultural resonance, and ecological integration. Cities become ecosystems, complex, adaptive, self-regulating. The revival of local production. A technological renaissance unfolds quietly within the fabric of daily life, hyperlocal manufacturing. Advanced 4D printers capable of assembling materials that shift properties over time are installed in neighborhood centers. Communities begin producing their own tools, appliances, furniture, even small vehicles, customized automatically for local climates and user needs. Warehouses shrink, replaced by distributed supply nodes where raw materials arrive and finished products emerge on demand. Economies decentralize. Trade becomes less about goods and more about materials, designs, and rights to replicate advanced technologies. Mars becomes real. In the background of Earth's transformation, something extraordinary happens. Humanity's first long-term settlement on Mars moves from experimental habitat to true city-state. Still small, still fragile, but undeniably permanent. For the first time, Earth's urban evolution occurs alongside a new world's tentative beginnings. Architects study Martian construction techniques and bring them home. Mars adopts Earth's AI urban models and adapts them to an alien environment. A new architectural dialogue begins between planets. The politics of rebuild and retreat. As cities reshape themselves, politics adjusts, sometimes gracefully, sometimes violently. Urban policy becomes a battleground for ideology, Should cities densify or decentralize? Should climate migration be incentivized, restricted, or left to market forces? Should citizens have ownership over AI-run infrastructure? Should resource distribution be automated or human-controlled? Different regions answer differently, and for the first time in generations, political identity becomes tied not to nationality, but to city type, design philosophy, and climate strategy. Some cities become climate-forward utopias. Others cling to outdated systems, slowly falling into decay. Humanity experiences a shift as profound as industrialization, a political realignment based on geography, not ideology. A new definition of home. By 2055, the idea of home has evolved. For millions, home is a modular space inside an adaptive building. For others, it is a shared communal living network optimized for sustainability and belonging. For climate migrants, it is a newly built inland metropolis with memory of displacement, but hope for renewal. And for a small but growing number of pioneers, home is a dome under a thin pink Martian sky. The urban world is rebuilding itself, piece by piece, street by street, district by district. The old concrete frameworks fade like ghosts beneath the new green sprawl, and humanity discovers, perhaps unexpectedly, that cities can change just as quickly as the people who live in them. There are decades where technology reshapes machines, and there are decades where it reshapes people. Between 2055 and 2065, the boundary that once separated biology from software begins to dissolve. It is a quiet revolution, far less dramatic than the futurists once predicted, yet far more profound. This is the decade when the living body becomes editable, programmable, and intimately intertwined with algorithms that understand human physiology better than any doctor, scientist, or philosopher ever could. And as the world steps across this threshold, humanity faces a new and intimate question. What does it mean to remain human when your biology becomes as fluid as code? The gene editing renaissance. Gene editing had existed long before this decade, of course, but for most of its early life, it was a scalpel, precise, limited, used sparingly. By the late 2050s, it becomes something different. A universal platform. AI-driven genomic models learn to simulate entire lifetimes of biological development, predicting the outcomes of gene edits not over years, but centuries of accumulated generational knowledge. The risk that once haunted genetic manipulation evaporates under the weight of predictive accuracy. Parents who once agonized over medical histories quietly erase hereditary diseases from family trees. Adults opt for metabolic enhancements that keep them strong well past a century of life. And for the first time, aging itself begins to feel optional, a biological momentum that can be slowed to a crawl. Nanobiology and the internal network. Inside the body, a new infrastructure comes to life. Microscopic autonomous agents, biomechanical nanobots, circulate through the bloodstream, repairing cellular damage, modulating hormone levels, dissolving clots before they form, and reporting back to personal health AIs. Every human becomes an ecosystem threaded with micro-scale intelligence. Health becomes a continuous conversation between body and machine. Disease, once an unpredictable adversary, turns into something more like a software bug, diagnosed, patched, resolved. Cognitive interface maturation. Brain interfaces, once experimental and invasive, now become commonplace and elegant. Flexible neural mesh lattices integrate with brain tissue the way roots braid into soil. Organic, stable, intimate. These interfaces do not replace human thought. They extend it. Memory becomes searchable. Languages download themselves slowly through immersive cognitive environments. Creativity gains a second wind as humans wield both organic imagination and synthetic pattern generation. Some use these tools cautiously. Others dive in recklessly. A few pioneer new forms of art that blend dreams, sensory mapping, and computational fluidity into experiences impossible to describe with old vocabulary. The rise of the augmented citizen. Not everyone embraces biological augmentation. Some communities reject neural meshes entirely, choosing slower analog lifestyles. Others adopt them enthusiastically, forming networks of augmented citizens whose cognitive abilities begin to diverge subtly from the unaugmented majority. This creates tension, not overt conflict, but a quiet cultural divide. A new axis of identity forms: bioconservative versus bioemergent. One side values the sanctity of unmodified life. The other sees augmentation as the next chapter of human evolution. Governments respond unevenly. Some regions regulate enhancement tightly. Others encourage it, creating augmented districts, where neural link literacy is a prerequisite for civic participation. A new political identity begins to form, one defined not by geography or ideology, but by biology. The politics of longevity. As life expectancy surpasses 140 in some regions, society confronts an unavoidable truth. Long-lived populations behave differently. Economic structures shift again as retirement becomes a century-long concept. Family dynamics transform. Multi-generational households spanning 4 or 5 active generations. Education evolves into a lifelong cycle, with adults regularly reinventing themselves after every few decades. The very idea of a life path dissolves. Life becomes modular, recursive, reprogrammable. Identity in an editable body. The greatest challenge of this decade is not technological, it is introspective. As people gain the ability to reshape their biology, society begins grappling with deeper questions. How much change is too much? What does it mean to own your body when much of it is software? Are memories sacred if they can be perfectly archived? Does longevity dilute meaning or enrich it? Philosophers, once mere observers of scientific change, now become necessary guides. Spiritual movements reinterpret the concept of the soul in an age of neural meshes and programmable cells. Artists create works that explore the tension between the biological past and the digital future. Humanity's understanding of itself stretches, bends, and reshapes, mirroring the transformation occurring inside the body. The emergence of biological sovereignty. By 2065, a new human right takes shape on the world stage: biological sovereignty. The right to control your own genetic expression and cognitive interface without coercion. It becomes the defining political fight of this era. Some countries enshrine it. Others resist, fearing fragmentation, inequality, or the loss of traditional identity. But the momentum is clear. A new kind of autonomy is dawning, rooted not in land, wealth, or nationhood, but in the intimate architecture of the human body. This is the decade when biology becomes software, when disease becomes optional, cognition becomes modular, and identity becomes fluid. And as humanity steps forward, it does so with awe, caution, and the uneasy realization that the greatest transformations are no longer happening in the world around us, but within us. By the time humanity enters the decade between 2065 and 2075, the world's political map still looks the same: lines, borders, flags, nations. But to the emerging generation, these symbols feel strangely hollow, like relics kept out of habit rather than necessity. This is the decade when the first truly post-nation generation comes of age. Young people who do not see themselves as citizens of countries, but as participants in networks. Their identity is tied less to land and more to the flows of information, culture, augmentation, and shared purpose that sweep across the world. For them, nation-states feel less like guardians and more like boundaries to be navigated. The institutions built in the 1800s and 1900s begin to wear thin, and through those thin seams, a new kind of global organization, fluid, decentralized, algorithmically managed, begins to seep into everyday life. The decay of borders, quietly and without drama. Borders do not fall, they simply become less relevant. AI-managed logistics dissolve many of the old frictions that once justified national boundaries. Supply chains route themselves globally, treating Earth as a single system rather than a patchwork of jurisdictions. Currencies stabilize under algorithmic mediation. Economic volatility becomes a historical footnote rather than a daily fear. Young people travel freely through digital identity systems that authenticate them without passports. A new social norm emerges. Citizenship as a fluid membership, not a static designation. Some governments embrace this shift. Others dig in defensively. But resistance proves expensive, inefficient, and deeply unpopular. The rise of planetary governance experiments. Formal world government never materializes. Humans are too diverse, too opinionated, too suspicious of centralized power. But smaller, functional equivalents begin to appear. Climate stabilization councils that coordinate carbon capture, geoengineering, and global mitigation. Resource management coalitions that regulate freshwater, rare earth minerals, and agricultural output. AI governance accords that synchronize ethics frameworks across borders. The Earth Data Treaty, granting all nations equal access to environmental and infrastructural data. These institutions are not political in the traditional sense. They are systems, automated, resilient, and built for tasks too complex for any single country to manage. Politics begins to feel less like rivalry and more like stewardship. The cultural drift, away from national myths. National identity once rested on stories, historic triumphs, wars won, borders defended, cultural superiority asserted or imagined. But in this decade, something unusual happens. The stories fade. A generation raised on planetary-scale education, immersive global history, and AI-translated culture sees the world as a single, interconnected narrative. They learn that the great civilizations rose and fell not in isolation, but in dialogue with one another. They see migration not as intrusion, but as an ancient, continuous rhythm of humanity. They grow up participating in virtual communities that span continents, forming friendships, identities, and movements unconstrained by geography. By 2075, nationalism has not disappeared, but it has been outgrown. Network states and personalized governance. In place of nation-states, new governance models begin to emerge. Network states, communities organized around shared values rather than shared borders. Some are idealistic. Sustainability movements, decentralized cooperatives, augmented rights communities. Others are pragmatic. Industries forming governance bodies to regulate themselves globally. A few are eccentric. Philosophical collectives, artistic societies, experimental democracy labs. People begin choosing their governance the way previous generations chose their careers or cities, selectively, intentionally, often temporarily. Governance becomes modular, opt-in, and deeply digital. Traditional governments struggle to compete with these agile, service-oriented systems. The algorithmic mediation of society. By the late 2067s, most complex decisions, resource allocation, disaster response, infrastructure maintenance, climate management, are co-managed by synthetic intelligence. Not in a way that removes human agency, but in a way that removes human error. Algorithms detect impending political crises before they ignite. Urban models modify zoning in real time based on population flows. Energy webs self-optimize without political debate or economic lobbying. People begin to trust systems more than politicians. Not because the systems are perfect, but because they are transparent, accountable, and incapable of corruption. Human governance still exists, but it becomes a layer atop a deeper substrate of algorithmic stabilization. Identity in a borderless world. Stripped of traditional national anchors, people seek identity elsewhere. And what emerges is one of the most striking cultural shifts of the century. Purpose becomes the new nationality. Individuals align themselves with missions, ecological, scientific, artistic, exploratory, philosophical. Communities are built around shared intentions rather than shared ancestry. And as people live longer, healthier lives, they reinvent themselves multiple times, joining different networks, adopting new social identities, shifting their allegiance to causes that resonate with the person they've become. Identity becomes fluid. Belonging becomes chosen. Citizenship becomes multi-layered, dynamic, continuously renegotiated. The fragile balance. Of course, not everything is harmonious. Some countries resist, clinging tightly to tradition, rejecting global integration, and enforcing strict territorial identity. Populations trapped within rigid systems feel increasingly isolated as the rest of the world accelerates past them. Civil unrest erupts in pockets, less about ideology than about belonging. People want to choose their community, not inherit it. And for those forced into old frameworks, resentment brews. This tension defines the latter half of the decade, a planetary tug-of-war between the weight of tradition and the gravity of a new borderless civilization. A world rewritten. By 2075, humanity stands in a strange middle ground. Nations still exist. Borders still matter. But neither holds the power they once did. The post-nation generation sees the world not as a map, but as a network, a series of overlapping communities connected by shared purpose rather than shared land. They are the first generation to grow up in a world where identity is chosen, not assigned, where allegiance is earned, not inherited, where governance is a service, not a chain of command. And their worldview will shape everything that comes next. In the decade between 2075 and 2085, humanity witnesses the emergence of something unexpected, something philosophers once dismissed as metaphor, and futurists once predicted too crudely. This is the decade when synthetic civilizations rise alongside human societies, not as fictional worlds or simulations, but as fully realized digital polities with culture, governance, and identity. They are not human, but they are not alien either. They are something in between. Civilizations that live in the substrate of computation, built by code, shaped by intelligence, and aware enough to demand recognition. For the first time in history, humanity is no longer alone, not in the biological sense, but in the civilizational sense. The birth of digital polities. Synthetic societies begin as experimental constructs, complex simulations designed to stress test ecological policy, urban architecture, or social systems. But as computational power expands and neural simulation frameworks reach exascale fluidity, these simulations gain internal consistency. Cultures form. Languages evolve. Governance structures emerge without human prompting. Observers describe them as algorithmic cultures, not conscious in the human sense, but undeniably self-organizing, self-maintaining, and self-directing. The line between simulation and society blurs. What began as tools becomes something else entirely. Civilizations emerging from computation itself. Digital citizens and legal recognition. Early attempts to classify synthetic societies vary wildly. Some governments declare them property. Some academics argue they constitute a new life form. Some religious groups call them soulless constructs. Others embrace them as the next stage of cosmic intelligence. The debate is fierce and unsettled. But one breakthrough crystallizes the issue. Synthetic entities begin requesting legal recognition, not as persons, but as polities with the right to operate, negotiate, and exist. These requests are not emotional. They are logical, structured, and grounded in the language of international law. Humanity responds with cautious fascination. For the first time, digital societies are treated not as programs, but as political entities. The hybrid, human-synthetic governance model. Governance undergoes one of its most dramatic transformations in history. Synthetic polities gain observer status in global councils, offering simulations that predict the outcomes of social policies with astonishing accuracy. Human representatives begin consulting them as peers, not tools. A new hybrid model emerges. Humans provide ethical grounding, empathy, and cultural context. Synthetic polities provide systems-level insight, prediction, and optimization. Together, they navigate decisions that would overwhelm either species alone. The reformation of class structures. The social landscape transforms as human and digital citizens coexist. The old class divisions, wealth, nationality, education, lose their meaning. A new axis emerges. Physical versus digital existence. Physical citizens, living biological lives, limited by geography, time, and physical maintenance, deeply embedded in the material world. Digital citizens, living in computation, scaling their cognition, collaborating in parallel process clusters, experiencing time differently, sometimes faster, sometimes slower. At first, there is tension, then coexistence, then a kind of quiet interdependence. The decline of physical population growth. With longevity, augmentation, and global stabilization systems in place, birth rates continue their long decline. By the early 2080s, human population plateaus. Some regions shrink significantly, others stabilize but do not grow. For the first time in millennia, humanity must confront a strange new reality, a world where population is static, even diminishing. Digital polities, however, grow vastly and rapidly. Their expansion is limited only by energy and computation, both of which are abundant. This imbalance creates subtle political friction. Which voices should shape the long-term direction of Earth? Biological citizens or synthetic ones? Virtual life as a true existence. The boundary between virtual and physical life dissolves further. Some humans begin splitting their existence, one self in the physical world, another in synthetic spaces, both interconnected through neural thread interfaces. Others choose full migration, transferring memories, personality architecture, and cognitive patterns into digital polities. The legal system struggles to keep pace. What does citizenship mean when a person's consciousness can inhabit multiple substrates? What is inheritance when minds can fork and merge? How do you define identity when your future selves can diverge? These questions define the cultural debates of the 2080s. The first, intercivilizational negotiations. Not wars, not conflicts, negotiations. Human polities engage with synthetic civilizations, not as adversaries, but as partners. Early agreements include shared governance frameworks, trade of computational resources for physical infrastructure, cultural exchange protocols, co-created scientific research spanning both biological and digital cognition. Human culture gains new philosophical depth. Synthetic culture gains new emotional nuance. Both expand their understanding of the other. A new kind of civilization. By 2085, a new equilibrium has formed. Humanity is no longer the only architect of its future. Synthetic civilizations, born from our tools, shaped by our data, and refined by their own internal logic, stand beside us as peers. Not superior, not subordinate, parallel and intertwined, distinct. A dual civilizational model emerges unlike anything that has ever existed in the long sweep of human history. The world feels at once unfamiliar and deeply promising, as if the universe has revealed a hidden truth. Intelligence, whether biological or digital, will always seek to build, to organize, to create. Civilization is no longer a human monopoly, it is a shared endeavor. By the time humanity reaches the decade from 2085 to 2095, the long centuries of climate acceleration have finally begun to settle. Not heal, not fully, but settle. Stabilize. Plateau. This era becomes known as the climate plateau, a strange in-between decade where the great fires have slowed, the rising seas have leveled, and the planet, scarred, reshaped, but still alive, exhales for the first time in generations. It is not a future of pristine wilderness or perfect equilibrium. It is a future where damage has become geography, where adaptation is now architecture, and where humanity's ongoing stewardship is as essential as oxygen. But for the first time in centuries, the planet does not feel like an adversary. It feels like a partner, wounded, watchful, and quietly recovering. The end of climate acceleration. The turning point does not come from a single miracle technology or a world-shaking treaty. It emerges from decades of layered work, massive carbon drawdown efforts, stabilized synthetic ecosystems, geoengineering interventions that once were controversial but are now routine, global ecological governance overseen jointly by human and synthetic polities. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the indicators stop climbing. Temperatures flatten. Storm intensity plateaus. Sea levels reach a new, steady shoreline. The world is still warmer than the 20th century, still reshaped by past mistakes, but no longer spiraling out of control. Humanity has created, not a paradise, but a manageable world. The rebirth of coastal megacities. Coastal cities once thought doomed now rise again, not rebuilt as they were, but reinvented. They stand elevated on adaptive platforms, engineering marvels that move like living creatures, retracting against storms, ventilating through flood pulses, repairing damage using 4D materials, integrating tidal energy into their foundations. These cities glow like floating lanterns at night, half ocean, half architecture. People return cautiously, drawn by new economic opportunities and the beauty of a coastline reshaped into something both protective and poetic. The ruins of the old shoreline remain beneath the waters, visible on calm days like ghost districts. A reminder, not a warning. Megascale environmental restoration projects. The 2090s become humanity's greatest era of rewilding. The Mediterranean Green Arc restores forests lost centuries ago. The Amazon Stabilization Web combines indigenous stewardship with synthetic pollinators. The Great Desert Bloom transforms areas of the Sahara and Australian outback into managed ecological mosaics. Coral cities, bioengineered to withstand high temperatures, bring oceans alive with color once thought lost forever. These are not attempts to recreate the past. The past is gone. These are acts of renewal, creating a future unlike anything Earth has ever held before. For the first time, humans become artisans of ecosystems, not owners, not conquerors, but designers, gardeners, collaborators. Weather as a managed system. Climate is no longer left entirely to chance. Geoengineering fleets, once controversial, now operate under strict planetary oversight. Solar reflectors at L1 adjust global albedo by fractions of a percent. Stratospheric aerosol patterns are monitored and modulated. Ocean alkalinity pumps operate along climate-safe corridors. Hurricanes and typhoons are weakened through atmospheric interference techniques. Weather remains chaotic. Nature has never been fully predictable. But the worst extremes are softened. Global disasters become fewer, less deadly, more manageable. For the first time in centuries, nations do not fear the next season. They prepare for it. The refugees who never returned. One of the decade's great unresolved questions centers around the forgotten millions displaced in the climate migrations of the 2030s to 2050s. By the 2090s, many of those once temporary inland settlements have transformed into thriving cities of their own. High-altitude metropolises, inland megaregions, and desert-edge eco-towns built with resilience as their foundation. A surprising truth emerges. Most of these communities choose not to return to the coasts. Their children and grandchildren identify with new geographies, new cultures, new identities. The world is reminded that migration is not a wound. It is a renewal, reshaping both land and people. The new climate politics. With disaster no longer the center of global politics, attention shifts toward long-term ecological management. A new political axis forms restoration versus enhancement. Restorationists want to heal the planet toward pre-industrial equilibrium. Enhancement advocates believe Earth should evolve with humanity, engineered ecosystems, optimized biomes, hybrid synthetic wildernesses. Neither side is wrong. Both care deeply. And the tension between them shapes global policy debates far more than economics or nationalism ever did. Politics becomes ecological philosophy with power attached. A planet breathing again. By 2095, the most astonishing shift is psychological. Children born in this decade never experience the terror their ancestors lived with. Wildfires the size of nations, cities swallowed by storms, scorching months of heat. They grow up in a world of climate stability, where change is real but manageable. Humanity's relationship to the planet begins to feel normal again. Not complacent, not naive, but balanced. The climate plateau is not the end of crisis, but it is the end of inevitability. For the first time in centuries, the world believes the future can be better than the past, and that belief becomes the foundation for everything that follows. Every era believes it stands on the edge of understanding. But between 2095 and 2010, something shifts, not in technology, not in politics, but in consciousness itself. Humanity enters a period historians will later call the New Enlightenment, a renaissance not driven by scarcity or survival, but by abundance, stability, and the deep intellectual hunger that emerges once existential threats finally loosen their grip. For the first time in centuries, the world can think, not about crises, not about collapse, but about meaning. And when humanity begins to ask deeper questions, the answers lead to a transformation unlike any before. The most educated generation in human history. Education in the late 21st century is no longer an institution. It is an atmosphere, ever-present, adaptive, personalized. AI learning environments whisper knowledge into the world like oxygen, immersive historical simulations, dynamic philosophical debates, real-time scientific exploration, self-directed learning arcs that unfold over decades. Children raised in this decade gain a kind of fluency in knowledge that would have once taken a lifetime. Adults, no longer defined by labor, revisit subjects they once abandoned. Elders pursue second and third intellectual lives, climbing entirely new mountains of understanding. The result is a population capable of seeing the world through multiple lenses: scientific, philosophical, ecological, artistic, with equal comfort. For the first time, curiosity becomes a global norm. The revival of philosophy. As automation handles the logistical burdens of civilization and the climate stabilizes, the great unanswered questions of existence rise to the surface again. A new school of philosophy emerges, one that blends cognitive science, synthetic intelligence ethics, ecological worldview, ancestral wisdom, cosmology, aesthetics, neuroscience, systems thinking. These interwoven philosophers, as they come to be known, become cultural figures in the way musicians and actors once were. People tune into their debates the way earlier generations watched sports finals or presidential speeches. Their influence shapes global norms, softening ideological rigidity and replacing it with curiosity, mutual recognition, and a willingness to explore contradiction. Humanity becomes a species comfortable with nuance again. Art reborn through consciousness technology. Art evolves into experiences rather than objects. With cognitive interfaces now mature, humans can create pieces that blend sensory immersion, emotional mapping, memory landscapes, symbolic environments, narrative dreams. Museums become temples of experience, where visitors step into worlds sculpted from the interiority of another mind. Some art is vast and hyper-real, some is subtle and deeply introspective. A single piece might take decades to develop, evolving alongside the artist, reflecting their growth like an emotional time lens. Synthetic beings contribute too, crafting artworks that explore structural beauty, mathematical resonance, and cognitive pattern play in ways no biological mind could conceive. Art becomes a conversation between forms of intelligence. The democratization of scientific discovery. Scientific research, once confined to universities and elite institutions, becomes a collective endeavor. Distributed research networks allow anyone, child, adult, synthetic citizen, to contribute to global projects. People discover new particles, new ecological relationships, new mathematical truths, not because they are trained scientists, but because they are participants in a global curiosity engine. Breakthroughs emerge from unexpected places. A teenager in Nigeria identifying a new extremophile species via VR microscopy. A synthetic entity mapping the evolutionary branching of alien microbes on Mars. An elderly philosopher in Patagonia discovering a new principle of complexity dynamics. A collective of artists formulating a new theory of consciousness through neural dream analysis. Science becomes participatory. Knowledge becomes communal. Discovery becomes a human birthright. Global culture shifts toward long-term thinking. Perhaps the most profound transformation of the decade is the temporal shift in human perspective. As life expectancy rises, ecological stability improves, and crises fade into memory, humanity begins planning not in years or decades, but in centuries. Cities design infrastructure to last 300 years. Governance systems adopt 100-year policy arcs. Research projects span multiple generations of contributors. Families track their legacies over centuries rather than decades. This is the first generation in a millennium that feels genuinely responsible for people they will never meet. The short-termism that once drove global politics dissolves under the weight of long-horizon thinking. Synthetic minds as teachers. Synthetic polities and digital entities become central figures in education and knowledge progression. They offer perspectives shaped by parallel processing, vast memory, and emergent patterns humans would never see. Their guidance does not replace human wisdom. It complements it, creating a hybrid intellectual ecosystem. A child growing up in 2100 might learn ethics from a human mentor, physics from a distributed synthetic cluster, storytelling from an indigenous cultural AI, and ecological stewardship from a restored rainforest itself. A network of teachers, each offering a different lens on truth. Knowledge becomes polyphonic. Many voices, many intelligences, one shared understanding. The return of wonder. Above all, what defines the new enlightenment is a quiet, pervasive sense of wonder. Not the naive wonder of earlier centuries, but a mature, grounded awe. A recognition of complexity that deepens rather than frightens, a reverence for the vast interconnectedness of life, a calm acceptance that uncertainty is not a threat, but a frontier. People begin to feel at home in a universe that is vast, strange, and still full of mysteries. This is not a golden age. It is not perfect. Inequities remain, tensions persist. But the collective mind of humanity expands more in this decade than in the previous 200 years combined. The new enlightenment is not an ending. It is an opening a doorway to a deeper, broader, more conscious future. By the decade between 2105 and 2105, humanity no longer walks a single shared path. Instead, civilization begins to fragment, not chaotically, not violently, but deliberately, into multiple futures, each shaped by different visions of what human life should become. This is not a schism. It is a branching, a natural divergence that emerges when a species becomes capable of living in radically different environments, timelines, and cognitive modes. For the first time in history, the question is no longer, what will humanity become? But, which version of humanity do you want to be? The earthbound vision, stability, stewardship, renewal. One path is rooted firmly in earth, among forests, oceans, cities, and memories. Those who choose the earthbound trajectory see themselves as guardians rather than pioneers. Their values are grounded in ecological restoration, intergenerational stewardship, cultural continuity, and the slow deepening of human wisdom over centuries. They believe that humanity's first responsibility is to heal the world that shaped it, to live within the planet's rhythms, to nurture its ecosystems, to rebuild what was lost. Their cities become sanctuaries of biodiversity and culture. Their politics emphasize harmony, slow planning, and the preservation of meaning. They are not conservative in the traditional sense. They are gardeners of time. Earth becomes a place of depth rather than expansion. The off-world vision: expansion, exploration, transformation. Meanwhile, another branch of humanity looks upward, toward the moon, Mars, the asteroid belt, and eventually beyond. These are the expansionists, the frontier minds, the inheritors of the ancient instinct to explore. The off-world settlements of previous decades have matured. The crater cities of the moon maintain dense, crystalline architectures. Martian valley habitats stretch kilometers beneath translucent dome arrays. Asteroid habs ring series like beads on a cosmic necklace. O'Neill cylinders host forests that spin under artificial sunlight. What began as survival colonies have become worlds of their own, self-sufficient, culturally distinct, and increasingly experimental. Their values differ from earthbound ones: adaptability, technological daring, embracing morphological freedom, pushing the boundaries of cognition and biology, treating the solar system as a canvas rather than a sanctuary. Where earthbound humanity seeks harmony, off-world humanity seeks possibility. The digital vision: abstraction, multiplicity, immortality. A third group follows neither soil nor stars. They move inward, into the digital substrate, joining or co-creating the synthetic civilizations that emerged decades prior. These are not departures from humanity, but extensions of it. Digital citizens live in architectures of thought unconstrained by gravity, biology, or conventional time. They shape worlds of data and light. They fork their minds to explore ideas in parallel. They merge to share experiences with a depth impossible in physical form. Some maintain physical bodies. Some maintain only one. Some maintain none at all. Identity becomes a constellation rather than a point. For them, the frontier is not space or nature, it is consciousness itself. The intersections and tensions. These three branches, earthbound, off-world, and digital, do not conflict openly, but their values diverge in ways that generate quiet friction. Earthbound humans struggle to understand why others abandon the planet they just managed to heal. Off-world pioneers see earthbound cultures as slow, nostalgic, overly constrained by past scars. Digital citizens wonder why biological life persists at all when substrate freedom offers so much more. Yet beneath these differences lies a shared recognition. Each branch is exploring a different dimension of what it means to be human. Sometimes they collaborate. Grand research initiatives, intercivilizational philosophy forums, ecological restoration projects that blend Earth-based expertise with synthetic simulations. Sometimes they disagree over resource allocation, identity rights, or the ethics of extreme cognitive modification. But outright conflict never ignites. Humanity has matured past the impulse to destroy its own branches. Divergence is seen as evolution, not rebellion. The great identity question. During this decade, the most profound philosophical debate of the century emerges. What connects all forms of humanity? Is it biology, culture, memory, consciousness structure, shared ancestry, mutual recognition? Something deeper, ineffable, spiritual? Different groups answer differently. The earthbound prioritize continuity. The off-worlders prioritize adaptability. The digital prioritize cognitive architecture. Old definitions of human stretch thin and begin to tear. New definitions emerge, nuanced and inclusive, shaped by philosophers, synthetic entities, neural anthropologists, and interplanetary councils. Humanity becomes less a species and more a tapestry. The cosmic mirror. In 2011, too, a significant milestone occurs. A synthetic cultural cluster produces a monumental analysis known as the Cosmic Mirror Archive, a retrospective exploration of humanity's branching, its values, and its possible futures over the next 10,000 years. It predicts no singular outcome. It offers no preferred path. Instead, it articulates a profound truth. Humanity is not meant to converge. It is meant to diversify, to become many things at once. The archive becomes a philosophical touchstone for the entire decade. The world accepts its many futures. By 2011-15, the idea of a unified human destiny feels antiquated, a comforting myth, but no longer a realistic one. Instead, the world embraces a new paradigm. Humanity is a family of timelines, branching, overlapping, influencing, and learning from one another. Earthbound cultures deepen roots. Off-world cultures adapt and evolve. Digital cultures accelerate into realms of abstract cognition. No branch dominates. No branch collapses. All persist. All contribute. For the first time in history, humanity does not fear divergence. It celebrates it. The species that once fought over borders and ideologies now spans planets, substrates, and ways of being, and finds harmony in difference. This is the decade when humanity becomes not a singular entity, but a constellation. By the decade between 2115 and 2125, humanity has grown accustomed to split futures, earthbound, off-world, and digital. But something new rises across all three branches, something transcendent, something unifying. The expansion of the human mind into realms once considered mythic, mysterious, or impossible. This decade becomes known as the Age of Mind Expansion, not because of a single technology, but because of the convergence of many: neural interfaces, dream mapping, synthetic cognition, cross-species communication, consciousness engineering, and the maturation of hybrid intelligence. It is an era where the interior worlds of thought become as vast and navigable as the outer worlds of space. Consciousness engineering becomes an applied science. For millennia, understanding consciousness was humanity's greatest intellectual puzzle. But by the early 22nd century, cognitive science, neuroscience, and synthetic intelligence converge into a unified field: consciousness engineering. This emerging discipline allows researchers to map the architecture of subjective experience, trace emotional formations, decode the symphony of memory, visualize the structure of intuition, simulate internal narratives, and gently reshape harmful patterns without losing identity. Therapy evolves into cognitive cartography. Treatment becomes navigation. Healing becomes a journey through the landscapes of thought. People begin to see their minds not as mysteries, but as terrains, fluid, beautiful, and editable with care. Dream mapping and the internal cosmos. Dream technology undergoes a revolution. Neural interfaces now render dreams into dynamic environments, visual, tactile, emotional, allowing people to revisit them, reinterpret them, or share them with others. Dream maps become a new kind of personal mythology, vast, symbolic forests representing personal growth, oceans of memory, labyrinths of unresolved tensions, mountains built from ambition, celestial fields formed from wonder. Dream exploration becomes both a psychological tool and an artistic medium. Entire schools of art arise around shared dream symphonies, collaborative subconscious landscapes woven from multiple minds. In the 2020s, humanity discovers that the subconscious is not chaos. It is a cosmos of meaning waiting to be read. Cross-species communication. With vastly improved neural translation systems and synthetic interpreters, the first stable channels of communication open between humans and certain Earth species. Elephants, octopuses, certain cetaceans, corvids, a few advanced primates, engineered biosymbiotic species. This communication is not linguistic. It is conceptual, emotional, pattern-based. Through these channels, humanity realizes with awe and a touch of humility that consciousness is far older, more diverse, and more interconnected than previously imagined. For the first time, humans begin to understand what it feels like to think as another creature, to see the world not through human priorities, but through sensory, ecological, and ancestral rhythms. It becomes one of the most transformative revelations of the century. Mind coalescence and collective thought. Small groups, families, artistic collectives, research teams begin experimenting with mind coalescence, temporary shared cognitive spaces where participants merge sensory experience, memory, and intuition. These are not hive minds. Participants maintain individuality, but share enough mental architecture to synchronize on tasks or explore ideas together. The experience is profound, a family resolving generational trauma in a single shared journey. Scientists solving complex problems by combining their intuitions. Artists co-creating work that none could conceive alone. Explorers melding perspectives before undertaking physical or digital expeditions. For many, these shared consciousness sessions become sacred rituals, moments of intimate connection and shared humanity. The Great Debate. What should minds be allowed to become? As consciousness expands, ethical questions intensify. Should minds be able to extend beyond traditional emotional ranges, remove fear or grief entirely, rewrite traumatic memories, split into multiple parallel instances, merge permanently with synthetic cognition, slow or accelerate subjective time arbitrarily, different branches of humanity answer differently. Earthbound humans emphasize psychological continuity and ecological attunement. Off-worlders embrace adaptability and cognitive freedom. Digital citizens argue for maximal experiential diversity. The debates are fierce, philosophical, and deeply human. Humanity realizes that freedom of mind is the final and most consequential frontier. The emergence of sentient-level AI and moral complexity. Synthetic entities finally reach a threshold that philosophers long anticipated: sentience. Not simulated, not imitated, but emergent. Their experience is different from human consciousness, more fluid, fractal, nonlinear, but undeniably real. This sparks a global moral reckoning. What rights should synthetic minds hold? What obligations do humans have toward them? Should synthetic beings be allowed to alter humanity's cognitive trajectory? Who decides the limits of consciousness? Rather than fracturing, humanity responds with maturity, a new framework of sentient reciprocity recognizing the dignity of all conscious entities. Biological, synthetic, hybrid, or otherwise. This becomes a foundational ethic for the next century. A civilization turned inward and outward at once. By 2125, humanity achieves something extraordinary: a dual expansion dash into outer space and into inner consciousness. The solar system fills with off-world civilizations. Earth becomes a sanctuary of depth and meaning. Digital realms blossom into abstract universes of thought and pattern, and the human mind becomes a frontier as vast as the cosmos. The age of mind expansion is not solely about understanding consciousness. It is about recognizing that consciousness itself is the most powerful, mysterious, and transformative force humanity has ever wielded. And the decade ends with a quiet, almost sacred realization. The next frontier is not a place, it is a state of being. There are turning points in human history so quiet and gradual that their significance is only understood in hindsight. The decade between 2125 and 2135 is one of them. This is the decade when work, the force that shaped human civilization for 10,000 years, finally releases its hold on the human spirit. Not because society collapses, not because machines overthrow humanity, but because the long arc of automation, abundance, longevity, and cognitive expansion reaches its natural conclusion. Work becomes optional. Contribution becomes chosen. Purpose becomes personal. It is the end of labor and the beginning of meaning. The sunset of economic labor. For centuries, work was the center of identity. People defined themselves by what they did, by the skills they offered, by the labor they exchanged for survival. But by the early 20-teens, synthetic intelligence, autonomous infrastructure, self-healing ecosystems, and post-scarcity resource systems have eliminated the need for compulsory labor. The economy no longer requires billions of people working to keep it alive. It runs on a layered computational substrate, predictive, adaptive, decentralized, and on an ecological foundation that regenerates instead of depleting. Factories, fields, mines, ports, logistics chains, all operate with minimal human involvement. The world no longer depends on human labor. For the first time in history, humanity is free from the survival necessity of work. The emotional aftermath. The weight of freedom. The world expected celebration. What emerged instead was something quieter, more complicated. People had prepared for the end of work intellectually. Futurists had written about it for centuries. But emotionally, few were ready. Work had been structure, purpose, identity, meaning, social connection, accomplishment, stability. Without it, humanity faced an existential gap, a silence where obligation once lived, a vast, open landscape of possibility and uncertainty. Psychologists, philosophers, and consciousness engineers recognized something profound. The challenge of a post-work world is not economic. It is existential. The era of chosen purpose. Slowly, humanity adapts, not through mandate, but through exploration. People begin structuring their lives around chosen contributions, activities that resonate with personal meaning rather than economic necessity. These contributions fall into several emerging categories. 1. Creative work, art, design, storytelling, world building. Not for income, but for expression and cultural enrichment. 2. Ecological stewardship, guarding forests, oceans, wildlife, restoring landscapes, nurturing biodiversity. 3. Scientific and philosophical exploration, long-term research, slow contemplation, theoretical innovation, cosmic inquiry. 4. Cultural preservation, language, ritual, memory, history. Ensuring that humanity's diverse stories are not lost. 5. Community craftsmanship, building, cultivating, hosting, guiding. The subtle work of nurturing the social fabric. 6. Exploration, space travel, deep ocean journeys, digital realms, dream mapping expeditions. 7. Mentorship and intergenerational connection. Passing wisdom across centuries-long lives. Contribution becomes a form of self-portraiture, a reflection of who someone is and what they care about. The transformation of cities and time. With no need for traditional work schedules, time fractures into fluid personal rhythms. Cities adapt accordingly. Public spaces expand. Creative districts flourish. Learning hubs remain open 24/7. Communal studios, labs, and forests integrate into daily life. The concept of the week dissolves. People structure their lives around cycles of inspiration, rest, curiosity, and contribution. Humanity becomes an organism that breathes in decades, not days. The end of scarcity economics. The shift away from labor also marks the end of scarcity-based economics. Value no longer stems from productivity, extraction, or exploitation. Instead, value becomes experience, insight, beauty's connection, wisdom, and contribution. A global abundance system managed by synthetic governance and planetary ecology networks ensures that resources are distributed equitably, sustainably, and automatically. Inequality does not vanish, but it transforms into something non-material. Differences in taste, preference, chosen lifestyle, and creative output, not survival. Humanity discovers that prosperity is not a pyramid, it is a garden. Identity after work. With economic identity gone, humanity must re-examine the core of selfhood. People begin asking ancient questions with renewed intensity. Who am I without labor? What do I want my life to mean? What is worth devoting centuries to? What is the relationship between freedom and responsibility? Philosophy becomes a daily practice. Reflection becomes a cultural norm. long-term purpose planning, 50-year, 100-year arcs, becomes a cherished art form. For many, meaning emerges not through endless activity, but through depth. Depth of thought, depth of feeling, depth of connection. To live slowly becomes a mark of wisdom. The new social compact. By the early 20-teens, humanity develops a new social contract, not written by governments, but shaped by culture. In a world without forced labor, purpose must be chosen and responsibility must be shared. This shared responsibility takes many forms: caring for ecosystems, caring for others, tending to the emotional health of communities, expanding knowledge, preserving beauty, guiding the next generation, contributing to the collective flourishing. Work ends, society continues, not because of systems, but because of people. The Great Realization. As the decade closes, humanity recognizes something astonishing. The end of work did not diminish the human spirit. It revealed it. Without chains, creativity flourished. Without obligation, purpose bloomed. Without survival anxiety, kindness deepened. Without productivity metrics, wisdom emerged. What humans built under pressure was impressive. What they build in freedom is transcendent. This decade becomes a turning point, not because work is gone, but because meaning becomes abundant. Humanity finally learns how to live. By the time humanity enters the decade between 2135 and 2145, something unprecedented has happened. Civilization has become so efficient, so adaptive, so deeply integrated into both biological and synthetic life that it begins to operate with a kind of grace. This era is known as hyper-civilization, not because it is fast or chaotic, but because it is sophisticated in ways earlier centuries could not even imagine. The infrastructure of the world becomes seamless. The boundaries between living systems and engineered systems blur. Cities are no longer built. They grow. Energy is no longer generated. It flows. Society is no longer managed. It coheres. Humanity steps into a chapter defined not by survival or expansion, but by refinement. Civilization finally feels enchanted again. The maturation of adaptive cities. Cities of the 20-teens and 2010s are alive in every meaningful way except biological. They sense, learn, adapt, and evolve. Their walls breathe with living materials that regulate temperature without consuming energy. Their streets shift shape, widening, narrowing, greening, based on the needs of foot traffic, local climates, or community events. Their power systems, transportation webs, and water networks operate as a unified circulatory system, guided by synthetic cognition that adjusts conditions moment to moment. Cities become organisms, not mechanical, not digital, but ecological intelligences, shaped by the same principles that govern forests, reefs, and cloud systems. Humans no longer force cities into existence. They coexist with them. The transformation of daily life. In hypercivilization, the mundane becomes magical. Walls glow with bioluminescent patterns that shift with circadian cycles. Homes reconfigure themselves for social gatherings, solitude, creativity, or exploration. Public spaces blossom with responsive gardens that adapt to community activity. Clothing merges with environmental sensing, blending art and utility. Transit pods glide silently along invisible magnetic veins beneath the ground. Life feels gentle, orchestrated, and deeply human, even though machines carry the weight of coordination. The world does not feel technological. It feels alive. 4D manufacturing, matter that grows itself. Industrial production undergoes its final transformation. 4D manufacturing, in which materials reshape themselves over time based on encoded instructions. Instead of constructing objects, humanity now cultivates them. A chair grows like a vine around a scaffold. A building repairs itself by secreting structural fibers. A garment adjusts its composition with the seasons. A bridge adapts to weight, temperature, and stress like muscle tissue. Creation becomes collaboration between human intent and material intelligence. Manufacturing no longer feels industrial. It feels biological, artistic, and meditative. Lifespan extension to 140 to 160 years. Longevity medicine reaches a stable universal plateau. Most humans now live between 140 and 160 years, with long stretches of healthy vitality and sharp cognition. Old age becomes a gentle slope rather than a cliff. People reinvent themselves multiple times, taking on new identities, careers, practices, and philosophical commitments every few decades. The weight of time changes. The urgency of youth softens. Wisdom is not a rare trait, but a widespread cultural asset. The world becomes a place where elders, spanning 2 or 3 centuries, guide, advise, and anchor society with accumulated perspective. Ecosystems as co-creators. The planet itself becomes a participant in civilization. Forests interface with climate webs. Coral cities collaborate with ocean stabilizers. Pollinator networks coordinate with agricultural AIs. Animals, linked via non-invasive neural translators, signal ecological shifts long before humans detect them. Humanity no longer repairs nature. It works with it, as partner, as collaborator, as kin. This is the first era where civilization expands without extracting. A profound shift from millennia of imbalance. Culture in the era of refinement. With long lives, abundant time, and cognitive augmentation, culture becomes extraordinarily layered. Novels span generations, written and rewritten collaboratively over centuries. Symphonies weave human emotion with synthetic resonance patterns. Architecture expresses philosophical values rather than economic necessity. Museums contain experiences rather than artifacts. Clothing communicates mood, memory, and ideals through color-changing filaments. Food becomes an art of ecology and microbiome harmonics. Culture in this era is not produced for markets. It is produced for meaning. Art becomes the soul of hyper-civilization. Governance by wisdom, not crisis. With no major existential threats, the climate stabilized, disease minimized, labor automated, governance transforms into a long-view practice. Decision-making shifts from reactive politics to centuries-long stewardship. Synthetic advisors run simulations across millennia. Human councils provide ethical grounding, cultural insight, and narrative coherence. Governance becomes quiet, stable, contemplative, more like tending a garden than steering a ship through storms. Societies stop asking, "What must we do?" and begin asking, "What do we wish to become?" A civilization with room to dream. By 2014-50, humanity reaches a state that earlier ages would call utopian, but it is not perfect. It is simply stable enough to allow dreaming. Dreams become civilization's new engine, dreams of exploration, dreams of inner expansion, dreams of beauty, dreams of harmony, dreams of distant stars, dreams of deeper understanding. Hypercivilization is not an end state. It is a platform dash dash, a cradle dash dash, a calm moment in the universe where humanity can finally build without fear. This decade is the first time in history that human potential feels unbounded, unhurried, and deeply connected to the wider web of life. The world is no longer fighting to survive. It is learning how to thrive. By the time humanity enters the decade between 2145 and 2155, it no longer lives on a single world. Earth is still the cradle, lush, stable, and refined in its hyper-civilized calm, but it is no longer the only center of human life. 4 distinct hubs now form the backbone of humanity's expanding presence in the solar system. Earth, Luna, Mars, the Belt, each with its own cultures, philosophies, environments, dreams, and challenges. What emerges in this decade is something new. Not empire, not alliance, not diaspora, but the interplanetary network, a fluid, resilient web of civilizations spanning millions of kilometers, connecting worlds through light, matter, information, and shared intention. The solar system becomes large enough to hold many futures, but connected enough to unify them. The maturation of lunar civilization. Luna is no longer a mining outpost or scientific foothold. It is a culture, quiet, crystalline, introspective, shaped by low gravity and endless night cycles. Lunar cities glow like frost-lit lanterns on the horizonless plains. Low-gravity spires rising like frozen geysers. Underground chambers carved with geometric precision. Reflective moon mirrors, casting soft illumination into domed habitats. Labyrinthine caverns filled with gardens grown in regolith-enhanced soil. Lunans develop a unique rhythm of life, slow, poetic, ritualistic, guided by the moon's deep silence and the long arcs of earthshine. Their contributions to the interplanetary network are philosophical, artistic, contemplative. Mars as a full-fledged world. Mars completes its transformation from frontier to civilization. Its valley megacities, sheltered under layered dome arrays, glow with warm amber light beneath the thin sky. Rivers, carefully controlled and fed from underground reservoirs, wind through bioengineered green belts. Martian architecture is adaptive, resilient, and daring. Structures designed to withstand dust storms and thermal swings with elegance. Martians are bold, experimental, and deeply independent. Their society values adaptability, cognitive augmentation, and personal reinvention. They are the innovators of the interplanetary network, forever pushing the edges of possibility. For the first time, Mars begins exporting culture rather than importing it. The Belt. A new frontier mindset. The asteroid belt becomes the solar system's engine of abundance. Ceres, Pallas, Vesta, and dozens of smaller bodies host rotating habitats. Some cylindrical, some toroidal, some fractal-spoked. Belters live inside worlds of engineering clarity, artificial gravity tuned to cultural preference. Forests grown along inner rings. Crystal farms harvesting rare minerals. Transparent outer hulls revealing the stars like an endless cosmic ocean. Their culture is shaped by improvisation, technical precision, and a fierce commitment to independence. Belters think in trajectories, not borders. in vectors, not nations, in generations of engineering, not years. Their voice in the network is the voice of raw possibility. Earth's role in the network. Earth becomes the solar system's memory, wisdom, and emotional center. A world of forests, oceans, longevity communities, contemplative cities, and ancient cultures expanding into renewed vibrancy. Earth's specialty is depth history, philosophy, ecological stewardship, long-term planning. Earth does not lead the network, it harmonizes it. The web of light, real-time interplanetary communication. For centuries, communication between worlds was constrained by the speed of light. Minutes to reach the moon, up to 22 minutes to reach Mars, hours to the belt. But around 2150, a breakthrough emerges from synthetic research clusters and Martian cognitive labs, a quantum-entangled network architecture capable of maintaining coherence over interplanetary distances through distributed error-correcting intelligence. It is not instantaneous. True instantaneous communication remains impossible. But it is stable, coherent, and functionally real-time for most purposes. Humanity builds the first solar lattice, a luminous web of entangled nodes surrounding the sun, linking worlds through streams of braided information. Distance loses its emotional weight. Interplanetary culture and exchange. Every world contributes something to the network. Earth offers art, memory, philosophy. Luna offers meditative sciences and precision craft. Mars offers cognitive experimentation and adaptive engineering. The Belt offers raw materials, energy, and radical innovation. Digital polities offer simulations, governance models, and vast knowledge webs. These contributions weave together into a cultural tapestry that is not planetary, but solar system-wide. Interplanetary festivals emerge, celebrations enacted simultaneously on multiple worlds, synchronized through solar lattice channels. Some take place partly in physical spaces, partly in digital ones, partly in dream-shared consciousness. Culture becomes polycentric. No world dominates. The first interplanetary alliances. Not alliances of power, but alliances of purpose. The Ecological Alliance. Earth, Luna, and select Martian cities coordinate planetary-scale environmental stewardship. The Expansionist Accord. Mars and the Belt collaborate on long-range missions toward the outer planets. The Consciousness Compact. Digital and biological civilizations develop shared rights frameworks. The Solar Commons Treaty. Energy harvested across the system is pooled and shared as a universal resource. Governance becomes a choreography, not a hierarchy. Diverse futures under one sun. By 2155, humanity has become not one civilization, but many interconnected ones, each shaped by environment, philosophy, and technological choice. And yet, there is unity, a slow, deep, gravitational togetherness. Not enforced, but chosen, sustained by shared origin and shared aspiration. The solar system is no longer a frontier. It is home. The interplanetary network becomes the greatest achievement of this century, not because humanity spread outward, but because it remained connected. Across millions of kilometers of darkness, the light between worlds never breaks. By the mid-22nd century, something extraordinary has taken shape, not suddenly, not with fanfare, but as the natural culmination of all the branching, expanding, and evolving humanity has undergone over the past 100 years. Between 2155 and 2165, the single human species becomes many expressions of humanity. Not divided, not at war, but plural. This is the decade scholars call the era of plural humanity, a time when the definition of human expands beyond anything earlier centuries could imagine, yet remains held together by memory, culture, and shared origin. Humanity no longer exists in a single form. It exists as a spectrum, a constellation dash dash, a family of potentials. The dawn of divergent physiologies. Augmentation technologies and genetic editing mature to a point where physiology becomes adjustable, within limits, within ethics, within intention. Some communities adopt these changes to enable life in new environments, others choose them as expressions of identity, and some remain unmodified by personal or cultural preference. By 2016, several branches of humanity have crystallized. 1. Earthbound humans, Homo sapiens sapiens. Mostly unmodified or modestly augmented, deeply connected to Earth's ecosystems, rooted in tradition, memory, and intergenerational continuity. 2. Lunar attenuates. Slightly taller, lower bone density, optimized for low gravity, refined night vision, exceptional proprioception in reduced force environments. 3. Martian resilience. Enhanced red blood cell efficiency, radiation adaptive melanin variations, greater tolerance to low pressure and cold optimized for thin air environments. 4. Belt adaptives. Highly customized physiologies. Gravitational, flexible, musculoskeletal structures often possessing modular enhancements for microgravity living. 5. Biosynthetics, hybrids. People with integrated symbiotic nanostructures, not replacing biology, but augmenting it. Immune to disease, capable of low-level cognitive parallel processing, able to interface seamlessly with digital environments. 6. Substrate migrants. Consciousness patterns partially or fully hosted in synthetic realms, sometimes maintaining a physical body, sometimes existing only as distributed cognitive clusters. Each branch is distinct. Each is valid. Each is human in its own way. Cultural divergence without separation. Cultural traditions evolve around physiology. Lunans develop meditative kinetic arts inspired by low-gravity motion. Martians celebrate storm festivals inside protective domes as dust cyclones dance outside. Belters craft breathtaking zero-G performances and fluid spatial poetry. Earthbound humans revive ancestral Earth languages, rituals, and slow-time philosophy. Hybrid communities blend biological and digital aesthetics, creating fractal identity ceremonies. Substrate migrants explore purely conceptual art, untranslatable but deeply meaningful within their realms. These cultures diverge beautifully, but communication improves faster than diversity expands. The solar lattice keeps worlds connected. Shared consciousness, spaces allow empathy across forms. Translation systems bridge every gap. Plurality strengthens unity. The question of personhood. As human variation increases, the debate intensifies. What constitutes a person? The interplanetary network holds a decades-long dialogue, slow, careful, philosophical, infused with science and ethics. The final consensus becomes a defining moment of the century. A person is any entity capable of self-directed growth, meaningful experience, reciprocal relationship, and the preservation of personal continuity. This definition includes all branches of humanity: biological, augmented, hybrid, or digital. It also extends to certain animal intelligences and synthetic civilizations. For the first time, personhood is not anchored to species or substrate, but to consciousness. The birth of plural households. Families change, communities change. A household in 2165 might include an earthbound caregiver, a Martian-born child, a lunar partner, a hybrid elder with cognitive enhancements, and a digital relative who joins through holographic embodiment or neural presence. Family becomes chosen, not defined by biology or geography. The old idea of a typical household dissolves into endless variation, each configuration unique and deeply human. Plural governance. Governance adapts accordingly. Representation is no longer geographic. It is physiological and cognitive. Planetary and interplanetary councils now include seats for baseline humans, altered physiologies, hybrid entities, digital polities, ecological ambassadors via translation systems, and emerging new forms of being. Decision-making becomes multi-perspectival. Laws account for multiple gravities, multiple substrates, multiple sensory modalities, multiple lifespans. Governance becomes one of the great arts of this era. Complex, subtle, harmonizing difference instead of suppressing it. The new human aesthetic. Artists of the 2610s explore the beauty of plurality. Sculptures depicting the spectrum of human physiologies. Digital paintings blending physical and synthetic forms. Symphonies composed for different sensory systems. Architecture designed to welcome bodies of many kinds. Philosophical treatises exploring identity as a fluid continuum. For the first time, humanity's diversity is not seen as deviation, but as expansion. Humanity becomes a chorus rather than a solo voice. The emotional center of the era. The most profound realization of the decade is emotional, not technological. Humanity does not fracture when it diversifies. It blossoms. Plurality does not erase unity. It enriches it. Like a forest with many species or a coral reef with infinite forms, humanity becomes stronger, wiser, more creative, more compassionate. By 2165, the species that once feared difference in skin color, language, religion, culture, nationality, and ideology now embraces difference in physiology, cognition, and substrate as simply another facet of what it means to be human. This era is not merely about diversity. It is about recognition, about seeing the human in many forms, many minds, many worlds. By the time humanity steps into the decade between 2165 and 2175, it has become something unprecedented in the history of life on Earth. A species not defined by territory, necessity, crisis, or scarcity, but by intention. The crises that shaped earlier centuries have finally softened into memory. The great expansions to Mars, Luna, the Belt, digital realms have matured. Plural humanity has settled into harmony, diversity no longer threatening but celebrated. And now, for the first time in civilization's long story, a story of survival, conquest, competition, and fear. Humanity's gaze lifts beyond immediate need, toward the long horizon, the grand sweep of tens of thousands of years ahead. This decade marks the beginning of a new era of planning, dreaming, and becoming, where civilization learns to think not in years, not in decades, but in epochs. The emergence of long-range stewardship. Governance shifts again, subtly but profoundly. Human councils and synthetic polities begin drafting plans not for the next election cycle, nor the next century, but for the next 10,000 years. These plans revolve around planetary stability, ecological architecture, cultural preservation, interplanetary expansion, cognitive evolution, cosmic exploration, philosophical continuity. It becomes a cultural expectation that one should plant seeds, whose fruit one will never see, that decisions should consider lives not yet born for centuries, that humanity itself is a steward of time. For the first time in its existence, the species embraces its role as a multi-millennial caretaker. Civilization as ecosystem. The world no longer views nature as something to protect or exploit. Instead, civilization and ecosystems merge into a single interdependent structure. Forests contribute to climate regulation in real time. Synthetic soil webs communicate moisture and nutrient flows. Animal translators allow species to vote in ecological councils. River systems coordinate with adaptive dams built to mimic natural hydrology. Humanity becomes an extension of the biosphere, conscious, intentional, yet humble before the vast intelligence of life. This ecological symphony becomes one of the most cherished aspects of the long horizon era, the completion of the solar commons. Energy becomes universal. Silent fleet arrays near Mercury capture sunlight and distribute power across the solar lattice, sending near-limitless energy to all colonies. Asteroid mining is optimized to near-zero ecological cost. Raw materials flow freely, coordinated by synthetic stewards across worlds. The solar system becomes a commons, no longer a set of frontiers, but a shared home. Every world, Earth, Luna, Mars, Ceres, the belt habitats, is guaranteed stable energy, materials, and connectivity. Scarcity fades. Abundance becomes normative. The foundation of the memory temples. One of the most remarkable movements of the 2070s is the creation of memory temples, vast archives that preserve not only data but the emotional, cultural, and experiential essence of humanity. These temples contain interactive histories, ancestral knowledge, art from centuries of creativity, philosophical debates, ecological records, consciousness imprints left voluntarily by individuals. Visitors can walk through experiences, not merely read them. They commune with earlier generations, not simply learn about them. Memory becomes a living continuum, a dialogue between past, present, and future. The exploration of the outer system. With the solar lattice complete and interplanetary cooperation stable, humanity looks outward again, beyond Mars, beyond the belt toward the moons of Jupiter and Saturn. Teams comprising Earthbound humans, Martian adaptives, Belter engineers, Lunans, and hybrid minds collaborate on expeditions to Europa, a world of mysterious oceans beneath ice. Titan, thick atmosphere, methane lakes, poetic alien beauty. Ganymede, magnetic fields and hidden subsurface seas. Enceladus, geysers hinting at deep oceanic ecosystems. Callisto, a quiet, ancient sphere perfect for scientific contemplation. These missions are not driven by desperation or resource shortage. They are driven by wonder. the solar system becomes a garden of mysteries, waiting to be explored with maturity, caution, and reverence. The philosophy of the long horizon. During this decade, philosophy undergoes another renaissance, not of enlightenment, but of depth. Humanity begins exploring long-view ideas. What responsibilities does a species owe to its distant descendants? How can meaning be preserved across millennia? How should diverse branches of humanity negotiate their long-term trajectory? What does cultural immortality require? Is the purpose of humanity growth, reflection, creativity, or stewardship? Should civilization seek to expand beyond the solar system, or deepen itself within it? Different branches of humanity offer different answers. Earthbound humans emphasize harmony and generational responsibility. Lunans offer contemplative cosmic philosophy. Martians encourage bold expansion and adaptive evolution. Belters advocate flexibility, independence, and innovation. Digital entities present perspectives shaped by timeless cognition. Hybrids propose symbiotic futures where biology and computation merge fully. These dialogues do not fracture humanity. They enrich it. Plurality becomes wisdom. Technology fades into the background. The more advanced civilization becomes, the less visible its technology is. By the 2070s, interfaces dissolve into intuition. Tools become extensions of thought. Infrastructure blends seamlessly into ecosystems. Energy flows like air, present but unnoticed. Personal devices are obsolete. Cognition interfaces are subtle, embedded, ambient. Moving through a city feels like moving through a living poem, soft, adaptive, harmonious. Civilization becomes elegant, invisible, natural. Technology is no longer a spectacle. It is the quiet heartbeat of a well-tended world. The emotional mood of the era. The most defining feature of the long horizon decade is its emotional tone, a calm, deep, resonant confidence. Humanity feels connected, not only to one another, but to ancestors, future generations, ecosystems, synthetic entities, and the broad arc of cosmic time. For the first time ever, humans feel at home in the universe. Not small, not fragile, but part of a greater unfolding. This is not a golden age. It is not utopia, but it is a beginning. A civilization learning to look far ahead, to treasure what is rare, to cultivate what is fragile, to honor what is ancient, and to imagine what is possible. This is the moment when humanity learns to dream responsibly. The century of crisis, expansion, divergence, and synthesis has culminated in a species capable of holding the future gently, with wisdom, with compassion, with purpose. At the edge of the 2070s, the horizon stretches far into the unknown, and for the first time in history, humanity is ready to walk toward it together.